Grachnarthos viglem cthanos zorpach undel.
Hey everyone, it's Mr. Hark here, and today I've got something truly extraordinary for you. We're diving into one of the most bizarre and carefully hidden stories from Hollywood's golden age, a tale that's been whispered about in film archives and among certain historians for decades, but never fully told. This is about Charlie Chaplin, one of the greatest comedians who ever lived, and an encounter he had in 1935 that would change how he thought about performance, intelligence, and what might be living in the forests of America. Now, most of you know Chaplin from his iconic little tramp character, the bowler hat, the cane, those perfectly timed physical gags that made the whole world laugh without a single spoken word. But what you probably don't know is what happened when he ventured into the wilderness near a remote mountain mine while scouting locations for his masterpiece, Modern Times. What he found there wasn't just inspiration for his film. It was something that defied everything he thought he knew about performance and mimicry. In the spring of 1935, Chaplin heard something in those woods. Strange rhythmic beats echoing through the trees, footsteps that sounded almost like his own signature walk, that peculiar waddle that had made him famous around the globe. When he investigated, he came face to face with a massive hairy giant who emerged from behind the pines and did something absolutely impossible. The creature copied his movements, not roughly, not approximately, but perfectly, as if it understood not just the mechanics of comedy, but the soul of it. Chaplin would later tell close friends that this being had better comic instincts than half the actors in Hollywood. He wasn't joking. The encounter lasted less than an hour, but it haunted him for the rest of his life, influencing his work in ways that film scholars have never fully understood until now. So before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss any of these hidden histories. And stick around to the end, because what Chaplin discovered about this creature's intelligence will absolutely blow your mind. All right, let's begin. Chapter 1, The Search for Authenticity. The year was 1935, and Charlie Chaplin was at a crossroads in his career. He had conquered silent film, becoming arguably the most famous person on the planet through nothing but physical comedy and expressive pantomime. But the world was changing. Talkies had taken over Hollywood. Al Jolson had spoken and sung on screen back in 1927 with the jazz singer, and by the mid-30s, silent films were considered relics of a bygone era. Studios were pressuring Chaplin to make his little tramp speak, to modernize, to keep up with the times. But Chaplin resisted. He believed deeply that the universal language of physical comedy transcended words, that his character could communicate more through a raised eyebrow or a perfectly timed stumble than through any dialogue. Modern Times would be his answer to the critics, a film that used minimal spoken dialogue but maximum physical expression to tell a story about industrialization, dehumanization, and the struggle of the common man against the machine age. To make this film authentic, Chaplin needed locations that felt real, not studio backlots with painted flats, but actual industrial sites, real factories, genuine mining operations. He wanted his audience to feel the weight of the machinery, the oppression of the assembly line, the way modern industry was crushing the human spirit. This search for authenticity led him north from Los Angeles, up into the mountains where mining operations still funk spirit, where the landscape felt untouched by Hollywood's artifice. Chaplin traveled with a small crew in those early scouting days. Just a driver, a location manager named Harold, and occasionally his assistant director. They weren't looking to shoot yet, just to observe, to feel out places that might work for key sequences. Harold had heard about an old mine operation near the Cascade Range, not quite as far north as Washington, but in that general territory, a place where the mountains still felt wild and the forest stretched for miles without interruption. The mine itself was partially abandoned. Some operations continued, but large sections had been closed down after a collapse in the late 20s. The equipment remained, though: rusting conveyor belts, old carts on rails, the skeletal remains of industrial ambition slowly being reclaimed by moss and weather. Chaplin was immediately drawn to it. The visual contrast between human construction and natural decay spoke to the themes he wanted to explore in his film. They spent 2 days photographing the site, taking notes, sketching out potential shot compositions. Chaplin had an eye for finding beauty in industrial decay, seeing poetry in the way light fell through broken windows onto rusted gears. But he wanted more. He wanted to find a section of forest nearby that could serve as a contrast, a place of natural peace that his character might escape to, even briefly, from the grinding machinery of modern life. On the 3rd day, Chaplin told Harold he wanted to explore the forest alone. This wasn't unusual. Chaplin often worked out his physical routines in solitude, testing movements and gags without an audience, refining them until they felt perfect. Harold was used to giving the boss space. He and the driver stayed back at the mine site, having lunch and discussing logistics, while Chaplin took a walking stick and headed into the tree line. The forest was dense with Douglas firs and western red cedars, their trunks massive and ancient. The canopy overhead filtered the sunlight into soft green shafts that made the whole place feel like a cathedral. The ground was soft with decades of fallen needles, and the air smelled of sap and damp earth. Chaplin walked slowly, taking it all in, occasionally stopping to test a movement, a stumble over a root, a surprised reaction to a low-hanging branch. Comedy was everywhere if you knew how to look for it. He'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when he heard it. A sound that stopped him cold. Rhythmic tapping, like footsteps, but with a particular cadence that felt familiar. Not random animal movement, not the irregular patterns of deer or elk. This was deliberate, patterned, almost like a dance. And the rhythm, it sounded like his own walk. The little tramp's signature waddle, the outward turned feet, the cane tap, the slight bounce in the step. Chaplin stood perfectly still, listening. The sound continued, coming from somewhere deeper in the trees, off to his left. It would go for a few beats, then stop, then start again, as if someone or something was practicing, rehearsing. His first thought was that someone from the crew had followed him as a joke, trying to mimic his famous walk. But Harold and the driver were back at the mine, and there was no one else around for miles. Curiosity overrode caution. Chaplin moved toward the sound, stepping carefully to avoid making noise himself. As he got closer, he noticed other things. A smell, musky and animal, but not unpleasant, like a horse or a large dog, but wilder. And the sounds themselves were getting louder, more distinct. Not just footsteps, but breathing, heavy and measured, and occasionally a low sound, almost like humming, deep and resonant. He came around a massive cedar trunk and saw it. At first, his brain couldn't process what he was looking at. It was too big, too out of place. A figure, easily 8 feet tall, covered in dark reddish-brown hair, standing in a small clearing between the trees. Its back was to Chaplin, and it was moving. Walking in a small circle, feet turned outward, arms swinging in that particular way Chaplin had perfected over years of performance. The creature was doing the little tramp walk. Chaplin's breath caught in his throat. His hands gripped the walking stick so hard his knuckles went white. Every rational part of his mind was screaming that this couldn't be real, that he was seeing things, that the altitude or the isolation was playing tricks on him. But his eyes, trained by decades of observing movement and physical comedy, told him something different. This wasn't a man in a suit. The proportions were wrong, the movement too fluid, the sheer size impossible for any human frame. The creature stopped walking and stood still for a moment. Then it raised one arm, bent at the elbow, and tipped an invisible hat exactly the way Chaplin did in his films. The gesture was perfect, down to the slight tilt of the head and the pause before the hand came back down. Chaplin felt his skin prickle. This thing, whatever it was, had seen his films. It had watched him perform and was recreating his movements with uncanny precision. Without thinking, Chaplin stepped forward. A twig snapped under his foot. The sound cracked through the clearing like a gunshot. The creature spun around, and for the first time Chaplin saw its face. Broad, flat, with a heavy brow ridge, and deep-set eyes that were dark and intelligent. Not animal eyes, not vacant or aggressive, but aware, curious, maybe even startled. The mouth was slightly open, showing large teeth, but the expression wasn't threatening. If anything, it looked surprised, caught in the act of something private. They stared at each other across maybe 15 feet of forest floor. Chaplin's heart was hammering, but his performer's instinct kicked in. He'd spent his entire career communicating without words, reading audiences, understanding how to connect through gesture and expression alone. He lifted his walking stick slightly and gave a small, formal bow, the kind the little tramp might give to a lady on the street. The creature's eyes followed the movement, its head tilted slightly, processing. Then, slowly, deliberately, it bowed back. Not a perfect copy of Chaplin's bow, but close, a clear response, an acknowledgement. Chaplin felt something shift in his chest, a mixture of fear and wonder and a strange kind of recognition. This wasn't just an animal. This was someone. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Chaplin stood with his walking stick, heart still racing, but mind beginning to work in that particular way it did when he was creating, when he was in the flow of performance. The creature stood watching him, its massive chest rising and falling with slow breaths, eyes locked on Chaplin's face with an intensity that felt almost human. Chaplin had performed for kings and presidents, for crowds of thousands, for camera crews and directors, but he'd never had an audience quite like this. He made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone watching, but to Chaplin, trained in the language of physical comedy and pantomime, it felt like the only logical next step. He was going to perform. He took a small step to the side, exaggerating the little tramp's waddle, feet turned out, cane swinging. He glanced back over his shoulder at the creature with that particular expression of innocent mischief that had made audiences around the world fall in love with his character. The creature's head followed the movement, tracking him. Chaplin took another step, then pretended to trip over his own cane, stumbling forward in that perfectly controlled way that looked accidental but was the result of years of practice. The creature made a sound, not a growl or a roar, but something that sounded almost like a chuckle, a low huffing noise that came from deep in its chest. Chaplin felt a thrill run through him. It got the joke. This massive being understood physical comedy, understood the humor in a well-executed pratfall. He had to push further. Chaplin straightened up, dusted himself off with exaggerated dignity, and then noticed a low-hanging branch nearby. He walked toward it with his characteristic swagger, not seeing the branch, eyes focused ahead. At the last second, the branch caught his hat and knocked it forward over his eyes. He stumbled, hands reaching out blindly, spinning in a confused circle, before finally pushing the hat back up and looking around with bewildered innocence, as if the branch had attacked him unprovoked. The creature took a step forward, then another. It was moving closer, and Chaplin felt his stomach tighten with fear, but he held his ground. The creature stopped about 10 feet away, close enough now that Chaplin could see the individual hairs on its face, the way its nostrils flared as it breathed, the remarkable expressiveness in those dark eyes. And then the creature did something that made Chaplin's breath stop entirely. It reached up to its own head as if tipping an invisible hat forward over its eyes. Then it stumbled, arms reaching out, spinning in a slow circle, mimicking Chaplin's routine. The movements were larger, clumsier because of the creature's size, but the intention was clear. The comic timing was there. It understood not just what Chaplin had done, but why it was funny. It was performing back. Chaplin started to laugh. He couldn't help it. The sound burst out of him, genuine delight mixed with disbelief and a touch of hysteria. Here in the middle of nowhere, in a forest where no human should be watching, he'd found perhaps the most gifted physical comedian he'd ever encountered, and it wasn't human at all. The creature stopped its stumbling routine and looked at him, head tilted again, and Chaplin could have sworn it looked pleased with itself. For the next 20 minutes, they performed for each other. Chaplin would execute a routine, a bit of business with his cane, a particular way of walking, a facial expression, and the creature would watch intently, then attempt to recreate it. Sometimes the mimicry was nearly perfect. Other times the creature would add its own variation, changing the timing slightly or adding a gesture that Chaplin hadn't included, and often these additions made the bit funnier, more surprising. At one point, Chaplin did his famous routine of fighting with a malfunctioning piece of machinery, treating his walking stick as if it had a mind of its own, wrestling with it, getting tangled up, finally throwing it away in frustration only to have it somehow end up back in his hands. The creature watched this entire sequence without moving, its focus absolute. When Chaplin finished, the creature looked around, found a fallen branch, and began its own version. The branch became a rebellious tool in the creature's massive hands. It twisted and turned, seemed to fight back, got stuck behind the creature's back in ways that looked impossible. The creature's face showed perfect comic frustration, the same expressions Chaplin used, the widened eyes, the set jaw, the final moment of defeat when it threw the branch away, only to have it bounce off a tree and land back at its feet. The timing was impeccable. Chaplin found himself applauding, actually clapping his hands together in genuine appreciation. The creature looked at him, at his clapping hands, and then brought its own massive palms together 3 times, creating thunderous claps that echoed through the forest. It was applauding back. The gesture was so human, so clearly an acknowledgment of their shared performance, that Chaplin felt tears prick at his eyes. In his entire career, he'd never felt so understood by an audience, so perfectly matched in his understanding of what made physical comedy work. But then, the creature did something that elevated their interaction to an entirely different level. It began to perform something original, not a copy of Chaplin's movements, but its own routine. The creature pretended to be picking berries from a bush, reaching up with exaggerated care, examining each berry with comic seriousness. Then it pretended to eat one and immediately made a face of extreme disgust, sticking out its tongue, shaking its head, pawing at its mouth. It had eaten a sour berry. The creature then looked around with exaggerated suspicion, as if checking that no one had seen this mistake, and sneakily tried to put the berry back on the bush. When it wouldn't stick, the creature looked directly at Chaplin with an expression of such perfect comic guilt that Chaplin burst out laughing again. This wasn't mimicry. This was original comic creation, a fully formed bit of physical storytelling with setup, execution, and punchline. Chaplin responded with his own improvisation. He pretended to be a factory worker on an assembly line, a preview of routines he was developing for modern times. He moved his arms in mechanical repetition, tightening invisible bolts, his movements becoming more frantic and robotic until he couldn't stop, his body locked in the motion even when there was nothing to work on, tightening bolts in the air, on his own clothing, becoming a slave to the mechanical rhythm. The creature watched this with what Chaplin could only describe as concern. When Chaplin finally wound down, collapsing in exhaustion from his imaginary labor, the creature approached slowly and placed one massive hand on Chaplin's shoulder. The touch was gentle, surprisingly so for something so large and powerful. The gesture seemed to say, "That's terrible. No one should have to live like that." Chaplin looked up at the creature's face and saw what he thought might be empathy there, understanding not just of the comedy, but of the social commentary underneath it. They sat together in the clearing for a while after that, not performing, just existing in each other's presence. Chaplin found himself talking, even though he knew the creature couldn't understand his words. He talked about modern times, about his fears that cinema was losing its universal language, about his belief that physical expression could communicate more than dialogue ever could. The creature listened, or seemed to, its eyes on Chaplin's face, occasionally making low sounds that might have been responses. At one point, Chaplin pulled out a small notebook he always carried, the one where he sketched ideas for gags and routines. He showed the creature some of his drawings, simple stick figures in various comic situations. The creature leaned in close, studying the pages with apparent interest. It reached out one long finger and pointed at a drawing of the little tramp being chased by a police officer, then made a huffing sound that might have been laughter. The light was starting to change, the afternoon sun dropping lower, and Chaplin realized he'd been gone for over an hour. Harold would be wondering where he was, might even come looking. The thought of his location manager stumbling onto this scene, of the chaos and attention that would follow, filled Chaplin with something close to dread. This encounter felt sacred somehow, private, something that would be ruined by exposure. He stood up slowly, and the creature stood as well, rising to its full height. Chaplin felt small next to it, fragile but not threatened. He did the little tramp's tip of the hat again, this time as a genuine goodbye. The creature responded with its own version, that same gesture but modified slightly, made its own. Then Chaplin turned and started walking back the way he'd come, forcing himself not to look back, though every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to see if this had really happened. He'd gone maybe 30 feet when he heard it, that rhythmic tapping again, the sound of footsteps in the little tramp's distinctive pattern. He did turn then, couldn't help it. The creature was walking away in the opposite direction, using Chaplin's walk, the waddle, the cane swing executed with a fallen branch, moving between the trees with surprising grace for something so large. And just before it disappeared into the deeper forest, it stopped, looked back over its shoulder with that expression of innocent mischief, and tipped its invisible hat one more time. Then it was gone, melted into the shadows between the trees, leaving Chaplin standing alone in the forest with nothing but the sound of his own heart pounding, and the absolute certainty that he'd just experienced something that would change him forever. Chaplin walked back to the mine site in a daze, his mind trying to process what had just happened, while his body moved on autopilot. The forest that had seemed so peaceful on the way in now felt charged with possibility. Every shadow potentially hiding something extraordinary, every sound potentially significant. He found himself looking at the trees differently, wondering how many times he'd walked through forest before without realizing what might be watching, what intelligence might be observing from just beyond the visible. Harold was pacing near the car when Chaplin emerged from the tree line, his expression shifting from worry to relief. "Mr. Chaplin, I was about to come looking for you. You've been gone nearly 2 hours. Are you all right? You look pale." Chaplin realized his hands were shaking slightly. He gripped his walking stick tighter to still them. "I'm fine, Harold. Just fine. I was working out some movements. Lost track of time." The lie came easily, automatically, but it tasted wrong in his mouth. He'd just experienced the most remarkable encounter of his life, and he was already hiding it, already protecting it with deception. "Did you find anything useful? Any spots that might work for the film?" Harold pulled out his notebook, ready to jot down locations. Chaplin looked back at the forest, at the wall of trees that had just given him a gift beyond measure. "No," he said quietly. "Nothing we can use here. The light's wrong, too enclosed. We should look elsewhere." Another lie, this one more deliberate. He was protecting the location now, making sure no film crew would ever have reason to venture into those particular woods, to disturb whatever life existed there in the shadows. They drove back toward Los Angeles that evening, and Chaplin sat in the back seat staring out the window, barely registering the passing landscape. Harold tried to make conversation a few times, discussing other potential locations, logistics for the shoot, but eventually fell silent when it became clear Chaplin wasn't really listening. The driver, a man named Pete, who'd worked for Chaplin for years, occasionally glanced in the rearview mirror with concern, but knew better than to pry when the boss was in one of his thoughtful moods. That night in his room at a small hotel in a mountain town, Chaplin couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the encounter in his mind, analyzing every moment, every gesture, trying to convince himself it had really happened, that he hadn't somehow hallucinated the whole thing. But the details were too sharp, too specific. The weight of the creature's hand on his shoulder, the sound of its breathing, the intelligence in those dark eyes, these weren't the vague impressions of a dream or a trick of the light. They were memories, solid and real. He thought about telling someone, Harold maybe, or his assistant director, but he could already imagine their reactions. The concern, the suggestion that he'd been working too hard, that the stress of the production was getting to him, or worse, belief followed by action. people wanting to go back, to capture evidence, to turn his sacred encounter into a spectacle. The thought made him physically ill. Chaplin understood, perhaps better than most, how the world treated the extraordinary when it was exposed. He'd seen it happen with his own fame, the way his private life had been consumed by public appetite, the way every gesture and relationship was analyzed and exploited. What he'd experienced in that forest deserved better than that. It deserved protection, silence, the kind of reverence you give to something holy. Over the next few weeks, as production on Modern Times ramped up, Chaplin found himself thinking about the encounter constantly. It influenced his work in ways both obvious and subtle. The film's themes about industrialization and dehumanization took on new urgency. He'd met something in those woods that was more human in its understanding and empathy than most of the people he worked with in Hollywood, something that lived completely outside the mechanical, soul-crushing systems he was satirizing in his film. The famous sequence where the little tramp gets caught in the gears of a massive machine, becoming part of the industrial apparatus himself, took on new meaning. Chaplin performed it with a desperation that surprised even him. The comedy tinged with genuine horror at the idea of being reduced to a mechanical function, of losing the humanity and creativity he'd seen so purely expressed in that forest clearing. His actors and crew noticed the change in him. He was more focused, more demanding, but also more patient with performers who struggled to understand his vision. He spent hours working with actors on their physical comedy, teaching them to find the truth in the gesture, the emotion underneath the gag. It's not about the movement itself, he'd tell them. It's about what the movement reveals. The comedy comes from character, from understanding, from empathy. One afternoon, during a break in filming, his co-star, a young actress named Paulette Goddard, asked him where this new intensity was coming from. They were sitting in his studio office reviewing dailies, and she'd noticed how he kept stopping the footage, analyzing tiny moments of physical expression with unusual fervor. "You're different lately, Charlie," she said, using the familiar name that few people were allowed. "Something happened during that location scout, didn't it? You came back changed." Chaplin looked at her for a long moment, weighing his words. Paulette was sharp, perceptive, one of the few people in his life who understood him beyond his public persona. He almost told her. The words were right there, ready to spill out. But then he imagined trying to explain it, watching her face shift from belief to doubt to concern, and he swallowed the truth back down. "I just realized something about performance," he said instead, "about how the best comedy comes from a place of genuine understanding, not just technique. I met someone who reminded me of that. Not a lie, exactly, just a truth so carefully edited that it became something safe." As Modern Times took shape, Chaplin found himself incorporating elements of his encounter in subtle ways. There's a sequence in the film where the little tramp working in a department store encounters a series of mechanical devices that seem to have minds of their own. The way Chaplin performed his frustration with these machines, treating them as adversaries with intelligence and intention, echoed his performance in the forest with the walking stick, the routine the creature had so perfectly understood. There's another moment, brief and easy to miss, where the little tramp is resting in a pastoral setting surrounded by nature, and his whole demeanor changes. The mechanical tension leaves his body. His movements become more fluid, more natural, more alive. Film scholars have noted this shift, commenting on how Chaplin seemed to find a different quality of performance in these nature sequences, something more authentic and less affected than his usual style. They didn't know he was remembering a clearing in the woods, a moment of perfect understanding, with something that lived entirely outside the industrial world he was critiquing. The film's famous ending, where the little tramp walks off into the distance with his companion, heading toward an uncertain future but moving forward with hope and determination, was influenced by that last image of the creature walking away between the trees. The idea that dignity and humanity could exist outside society's structures, that there were ways of being that didn't require participation in the grinding machinery of modern life, This became the film's final message. Modern Times was released in February 1936 to mixed reviews. Some critics praised its visual comedy and social commentary. Others felt it was outdated, a relic of the silent era trying to exist in a world that had moved on to talkies. The film's minimal use of dialogue was seen as stubborn rather than artistic, a refusal to adapt to changing times. But audiences loved it. They understood what Chaplin was trying to say about the cost of progress, the way modern life could crush the human spirit if we let it. At the premiere, standing in the back of the theater watching his film unspool, Chaplin thought about his audience in the forest, the one viewer who had understood his work more perfectly than any human ever had. He wondered if the creature was still out there, still practicing its comic routines in the privacy of the trees, still adding its own variations and innovations to the movements it had learned. The thought made him smile, a genuine expression of joy that had nothing to do with the applause echoing through the theater. Chaplin tried to stay away. He told himself the encounter had been a one-time gift, something precious precisely because it couldn't be repeated. But as the months passed, and Modern Times moved from production to release to the slow fade of public attention, he found himself thinking more and more about returning to that forest, to that specific clearing where he'd found the most perfect audience of his career. It was autumn of 1936 when he finally gave in to the pull. He told his staff he needed a break, some time away from Los Angeles and the constant pressure of the studio system. He'd been fighting with producers about his next project, defending his right to make films his way, without compromise. The battles were exhausting, and the excuse of needing solitude was accepted without much question. Chaplin often disappeared for weeks at a time when he was developing new material. He drove north alone this time, not wanting to explain his destination to anyone, not wanting company that would require conversation and distraction. The drive took 2 days, and he spent the nights in small roadside motels, lying awake and wondering what he was really hoping to find. The rational part of his mind insisted the creature wouldn't be there, that it had been a chance encounter, never to be repeated. But something deeper, some instinct he'd learned to trust over years of creative work, told him otherwise. The mine site looked different in autumn. The trees had turned gold and red, and the air had a sharp bite to it that promised winter wasn't far behind. The mine itself seemed more derelict than he remembered, more equipment removed or collapsed, nature reclaiming the space more aggressively. Chaplin parked his car in the same spot as before and sat for a moment, gathering his courage. He'd brought props this time, a bowler hat, a cane, a few other items from the little tramp's costume. If this was going to be a performance, he wanted to do it properly. He changed in the car, putting on the full outfit, feeling the familiar weight of the character settle onto his shoulders. The little tramp wasn't just a costume for Chaplin. It was a way of seeing the world, a lens through which he could express truths that Charles Chaplin, the man, might not be able to articulate. The walk into the forest felt longer this time, maybe because he was looking for something specific rather than wandering aimlessly. He tried to remember the exact path he'd taken, the landmarks he'd passed, but the forest in autumn looked different from the forest in spring. Colors had changed, undergrowth had grown or died back, familiar shapes were obscured or revealed in new ways. He walked for over an hour, starting to worry he'd never find the right clearing, that he'd imagined its location or that the forest had somehow rearranged itself. Then he heard it, that same rhythmic tapping, those distinctive footsteps. His heart leaped. He followed the sound, moving more quickly now, and emerged into a clearing that might have been the same one or might have been similar. The creature was there, and it wasn't alone. 2 of them stood in the clearing, the one Chaplin had met before, recognizable by its slightly reddish-brown hair and particular build, and a second one, smaller and with darker coloring. They were engaged in what looked like a performance, moving through a routine that Chaplin recognized with a shock. It was the factory sequence from Modern Times, the mechanical movements of workers on an assembly line, executed with surprising accuracy by these massive beings. The smaller creature was playing the worker, movements becoming more frantic and mechanical, while the larger one seemed to be playing the role of the machine itself, its arms moving like pistons, creating the constraints and pressures that drove the worker's increasing desperation. They were acting out his film, recreating it from memory, and doing so with an understanding of the material that showed they'd grasped not just the movements, but the meaning underneath them. Chaplin stepped into the clearing, and both creatures froze. The larger one's head snapped toward him, and for a moment Chaplin saw what might have been recognition in those dark eyes. The smaller creature took a step back, clearly more wary, but the larger one made a low sound, almost reassuring, and then did something that made Chaplin's throat tighten with emotion. It tipped an invisible hat, the gesture Chaplin had taught it months ago, the greeting and acknowledgement they'd shared. Chaplin responded in kind, tipping his actual bowler hat with the little tramp's characteristic flourish. The smaller creature watched this exchange with apparent fascination, its head tilting in that same curious way. What followed was the most extraordinary performance of Chaplin's life, and no one but these two creatures would ever witness it. He performed for them, running through routines from modern times and his earlier films, executing gags and sequences with all the precision and emotion he'd honed over decades of work. The creatures watched with absolute attention, and occasionally they'd join in, adding their own interpretations or creating complementary movements that enhanced what Chaplin was doing. At one point, Chaplin performed a sequence about hunger, the little tramp's eternal struggle to find food, dreaming of elaborate meals while his stomach growled. The larger creature responded with its own bit, pretending to find a berry bush, examining the berries with exaggerated care like it had before, then offering some to Chaplin with a gesture of such genuine generosity that the comedy took on an emotional weight that brought tears to Chaplin's eyes. They worked together, human and not human, creating something that existed only in that moment, that would never be filmed or recorded or shared with the world. The smaller creature gradually warmed to Chaplin's presence, eventually joining the performance, and Chaplin found himself directing them, showing them movements, watching as they adapted and modified his suggestions with their own physical intelligence. As the afternoon light began to fade, they sat together in the clearing, the three of them, and Chaplin talked. He told them about the film, about the response it had received, about his struggles with the studio system and his fears about the future of cinema. He had no idea how much they understood, but they listened, their eyes on his face, occasionally making low sounds that might have been responses or might have been something else entirely. The larger creature reached into a pile of leaves and pulled out something that made Chaplin's breath catch. It was a piece of paper, old and weathered, with a crude drawing on it. The drawing showed a figure clearly meant to be the little tramp, with his distinctive hat and cane, and next to it a larger figure, unmistakably the creature itself. They were both tipping their hats to each other. The creature had drawn this, had kept it, had remembered their encounter just as vividly as Chaplin had. Chaplin pulled out his own notebook, the one he'd shown the creature before, and found a blank page. He drew quickly, his hand moving with the confidence of someone who'd sketched thousands of gag ideas over the years. He drew the three of them in the clearing, performing together, and underneath he wrote in careful letters, "The best audience I ever had, thank you." He tore out the page and offered it to the creature. The creature took it carefully, holding the paper in its massive hands with surprising delicacy. It studied the drawing for a long moment, then made a sound that was almost like a sigh. The smaller creature leaned in to look, and they seemed to communicate something between them, an exchange of sounds and gestures that Chaplin couldn't interpret but felt was significant. As darkness began to fall for real, Chaplin knew he had to leave. The forest at night was no place for him, and he had a long drive ahead. He stood, and both creatures stood with him. The larger one extended its hand, palm up, in a gesture that was clearly an offering. Chaplin placed his hand in that massive palm, feeling the warmth and strength there, the gentleness despite the obvious power. They walked him back toward the mine site, the three of them moving through the darkening forest together. When they reached the edge where the trees thinned and the mine buildings became visible, the creatures stopped. They wouldn't go further, wouldn't risk being seen in the open. Chaplin understood. He turned to face them one last time. "I won't tell anyone," he said, speaking the promise out loud, making it real. "Your secret is safe. You have my word." The larger creature tilted its head, then placed one hand over its chest in a gesture that seemed to echo Chaplin's words. A promise returned. Then both creatures melted back into the trees, and Chaplin was alone again. He drove back to Los Angeles with that drawing on the seat beside him, the crude sketch that proved he hadn't imagined any of it. He kept it for the rest of his life, hidden in a private safe with other treasured items, never shown to anyone, never explained. It was his secret, his gift, his reminder that intelligence and artistry could exist in forms that society refused to acknowledge or accept. The years that followed were turbulent for Chaplin. The world was sliding toward war, and his next film, The Great Dictator, would be his most political and controversial work, a direct satire of Hitler and fascism at a time when America was still officially neutral. The film's message about the dangers of hatred and the importance of human kindness was influenced in ways no one knew by what he'd learned in that forest. The creatures had shown him something fundamental about intelligence and empathy. They had no language he could understand, no shared culture or history, yet they had grasped the essence of his work, had understood the emotional truth underneath the comedy. If beings so different from humans could achieve that level of understanding, then surely humans, with all their supposed civilization and advancement, could learn to understand each other, to see past superficial differences to the shared humanity underneath. The famous speech at the end of The Great Dictator, where Chaplin breaks character and speaks directly to the audience about the need for kindness and human connection, was written with the memory of those encounters in his mind. "We think too much and feel too little," he says in that speech. "More than machinery, we need humanity. More than cleverness, we need kindness and gentleness." Those words came from watching beings who lived without machines, without the trappings of civilization, yet possessed more genuine humanity than most of the people he knew. Chaplin never returned to the forest after that second visit. Part of him wanted to, desperately, but he understood that some gifts are meant to be received and cherished, not endlessly pursued. He'd been given something precious, a glimpse into a world that existed alongside his own but separate from it, and the right response was gratitude and protection, not exploitation. He did, however, pay attention to reports of strange sightings in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. Over the years, as Bigfoot stories began to circulate more widely in American culture, Chaplin would read them with a knowing smile. Most of the accounts were clearly exaggerated or mistaken, people seeing bears or shadows and letting their imaginations run wild. But occasionally there'd be a detail that rang true, a description of intelligence in the eyes, of deliberate communication attempts, of behavior that suggested more than animal instinct. In the 1950s, a friend who knew of Chaplin's interest in folklore and unusual phenomena brought him a recording, one of the early audio captures of what researchers were calling samurai chatter. Chaplin listened to it alone in his study, and his hands started shaking. The sounds were similar to what he'd heard in the clearing, those low vocalizations the creatures had made when communicating with each other. He listened to the recording 3 times, then put it away and never mentioned it to anyone. Later in his life, after he'd been effectively exiled from America during the McCarthy era and was living in Switzerland, Chaplin would sometimes talk to his children about the importance of keeping secrets, of protecting things that the world wasn't ready to understand. His daughter Geraldine later recalled him saying, "Some truths are too valuable to be exposed. They need darkness and privacy to survive, like rare flowers that wilt in direct sunlight." He never explained what he meant by that, and his children assumed he was talking about his own experiences with fame and public scrutiny. But those who knew him best, who had seen the faraway look he'd get sometimes when discussing performance and communication, wondered if there was something more, some experience he'd never shared that had shaped his understanding of what it meant to be human. Chaplin's later films, particularly Limelight and A King in New York, continued to explore themes of performance, authenticity, and the cost of civilization. There's a scene in Limelight where his character, an aging comedian, talks about the purity of performance, about how the best comedy comes from a place of genuine emotion and connection with the audience. The audience knows, he says. They can feel when you're being real with them, when you're giving them something true. The way he performed that scene, with a kind of wistful nostalgia, suggested he was remembering a specific audience, a specific moment of perfect connection. In his autobiography published in 1964, Chaplin wrote extensively about his philosophy of performance and his belief in the universal language of physical comedy. There's a curious passage where he discusses his location scouting for modern times, mentioning the forests near the mine site and how the experience there had influenced his understanding of communication beyond words. He wrote, "In those woods, I learned that understanding doesn't require shared language or culture. It requires only attention, empathy, and the willingness to meet another being where they are, in the language they speak, even if that language is nothing but gesture and movement." Scholars have puzzled over that passage for decades, noting that it seems oddly philosophical for what should have been a simple discussion of location scouting. Some have suggested he was being metaphorical, talking about his relationship with audiences. Others have noted that the passage seems to reference a specific experience, something transformative that happened during that trip. But without more context, it remained just another curious detail in the complicated life of a complicated man. Chaplin died in 1977 on Christmas Day, surrounded by his family in Switzerland. Among his personal effects, his children found the usual memorabilia, awards, photographs, scripts, but they also found a locked box that none of them had known existed. Inside was a weathered piece of paper with a crude drawing, a small notebook filled with sketches and notes about physical comedy, and a handwritten note that read, "To my friend in the forest, who taught me that art transcends species, that comedy is a language older than words, and that the best performances are the ones no one else will ever see. Thank you for understanding, C.C." His children didn't know what to make of it. The drawing was clearly old, the paper brittle with age, and the style was unlike anything Chaplin had drawn. It showed two figures, one recognizably the little tramp, the other something else, something large and hairy, both tipping their hats to each other. There were no other clues, no explanation, just that note and that strange drawing. Geraldine Chaplin, his daughter, who had become an actress herself, later said in an interview that she believed her father had experienced something in those woods that he'd never felt comfortable sharing, something that had shaped his understanding of performance and communication in profound ways. He always said that the best audience was the one that understood you completely, without words, without explanation, she said. I think he found that audience once, and it changed everything for him. The drawing and the note remained in the family's private collection, never publicly displayed, never fully explained. It became one of those curious footnotes in Chaplin's biography, a mystery that scholars and fans would speculate about but never solve. Some suggested it was a joke, a bit of whimsy from a man known for his playful nature. Others thought it might be related to a film project that never came to fruition, some fantasy or fable he'd considered making. But a few people, those who paid attention to the details, who knew about the persistent reports of strange creatures in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, who understood that the world contained more mysteries than it was comfortable acknowledging, wondered if maybe, just maybe, Charlie Chaplin had encountered something real in those woods, something that had recognized in him a kindred spirit, another performer, another being who understood that communication was about more than words, that connection could happen across the widest possible divides if both parties were willing to meet in the universal language of gesture, expression, and empathy.